Rome smelled like death every day, and no one stopped. 1 million people, no electricity, and a perfect system to keep everyone under control. They lived on top of one another. No light, no escape. No one told you the truth about Rome. No one. The story you learned in school was carefully selected. The monuments, the laws, the victorious generals. What was left out is what 1 million people lived through every night. Fear, darkness, and a system that needed their suffering to keep functioning. And beneath every admired aqueduct, every celebrated monument, every speech about civilization and greatness, there was a secret Rome buried deep, a secret that books rarely tell, and one that once you know it will change how you see power forever. Rome in the year 100 AD did not know silence. While the rest of the ancient world sank into the darkness of night and found some rest, the most powerful city on earth kept moving. Carts creaking over stone streets, vendors shouting, bodies stumbling through alleys swallowed by a darkness that protected no one. The poet Juvenal, one of the sharpest observers of his time, described Roman nights as a slow torture, impossible to sleep, impossible to rest, impossible to escape the noise that filled every corner. Rome never stopped, and that came at a cost few were willing to admit. The darkness that should have brought rest concealed something far more sinister in the streets of the capital. Without public lighting, the alleys became territory for criminals, fatal accidents, and deaths that would never be investigated. An ordinary citizen who needed to go out after sunset carried not just a torch, but the very real weight of fear of not returning. Chroniclers of the time recorded bodies found at dawn with no one knowing or wanting to know what had happened the night before. Rome's greatness had a literal shadow, dense and impenetrable. Fatigue, therefore, was not a temporary condition for the average Roman. It was the permanent state of existence in that place. Poor sleep, early mornings, labor under a relentless sun, and the constant noise of the largest metropolis of the ancient world. This was daily life. And it is precisely here that something begins to reveal itself. Rome was not built to be comfortable, it was built to function. And to function with that kind of relentless intensity, it needed to drain resources from entire continents without a pause, without hesitation, without concern for the cost. This veracity was no accident. It was the very design of the empire. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, Rome had become the largest urban organism the world had ever seen, consuming grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, timber from Gaul, and metals from Britannia in a supply chain unlike anything in human history. Emperor Trajan, one of the most ambitious rulers Rome ever produced, did not merely accept this colossal appetite, he fed it with massive construction projects, military campaigns, and a cold determination to turn Rome into the absolute heart of the known world. The city grew because it had to grow. To stop was to die. But behind every loaf of bread distributed in the squares and every column raised in the forum, there was a cost that never appeared in official records. Entire lands were drained to feed the capital. Conquered peoples saw their wealth siphoned away like water down a drain, with no negotiation, no compensation, no choice. Egypt sent hundreds of thousands of tons of grain each year to Rome, while its own farmers barely survived on what remained. Rome's grandeur was, at its core, a direct reflection of the impoverishment and subjugation of everything around it. And here is the detail that turns admiration into discomfort. A city that depends on a constant external flow of resources is not strong, it's fragile. Rome had created for itself a dependency so deep that any disruption in that chain became an existential threat. Stop receiving grain for a week and there is hunger. Stop for a month, and there is revolt. This model worked as long as the empire kept expanding, but empires are not sustained by food and stone alone. They require something far more brutal to keep turning. That brutal force had a name Rome never spoke out loud: slavery. The empire moved on the shoulders of millions of human beings who had no right to call their own lives their own. It is estimated that between 30 and 40% of the population consisted of slaves, a proportion that made the system not just common, but absolutely indispensable. There were slaves who taught philosophy to the elite's children in the morning, and there were slaves who died chained in silver mines without anyone around them even knowing their names. The same Rome that produced great thinkers was sustained by a suffering it chose not to see. Freedom, within this system, was not a right, it was a rare currency that very few managed to earn over an entire lifetime of submission. Some slaves gained manumission after years of service, becoming freedmen, a category that existed in a gray zone between slavery and full citizenship. But for the vast majority, there was no escape. Every clean street in Rome was swept by hands that did not choose to be there. Every stone in its aqueducts was raised by backs bent under force. Every meal served in the homes of senators arrived carrying with it a story of absolute invisibility. This is where the great illusion Rome sold, and that many still buy today, truly lies. The narrative of Rome as a masterpiece of civilization deliberately omits the real cost of its construction. It was not pure genius, it was genius built upon systematized suffering. And while the city took pride in its monuments and its monumental engineering, beneath it all there was an invisible infrastructure of pain holding everything upright. An infrastructure that concealed its own cracks behind a facade of technical perfection, cracks that ran far deeper than the eye could see. And speaking of a facade of technical perfection, few achievements in ancient history are as impressive as Roman engineering. The aqueducts carried millions of liters of water each day, crossing valleys and mountains with such precise gradients that the water flowed on its own, driven solely by gravity. Roman engineers calculated these inclinations with simple instruments, careful observation, and knowledge accumulated over generations. No computers, no margin for error. The result was a system that supplied public fountains, monumental baths, and privileged households with a consistency that medieval cities, centuries later, could not replicate. It was genuinely an engineering miracle. But this miracle carried a silent poison within it. Much of the water's final journey ran through pipes made of lead, the Romans' preferred material due to its malleability and durability. The problem is that lead is a neurotoxic substance that slowly dissolves into water, gradually and imperceptibly affecting the nervous system and cognition. Modern research has identified elevated levels of lead in the bones of ancient Romans, suggesting chronic exposure that poisoned the population without their awareness. Rome was drinking its own poison and smiling, proud of the engineering that delivered it. The engineer Vitruvius, as early as the 1st century BC, had already warned that water transported through lead pipes was less healthy than water carried through stone channels. But convenience prevailed over caution, as it so often does. Rome depended on systems that appeared flawless on the outside, but carried invisible flaws within. And this tension between appearance and reality did not remain confined to the pipes. It rose through the streets, passed through doorways, and settled inside every home where entire families struggled day after day to survive in the place they called home. Surviving your own home. That phrase may sound strange to someone living in a modern structure, but for the vast majority of ordinary Romans, the place where they slept was one of the greatest threats to their lives. The insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that dominated Rome's urban landscape, were constructed with cheap materials, little to no structural planning, and packed tightly together as if space itself were a luxury the city could not afford. Entire families lived in a single tiny room, hearing every step, every argument, every cry from their neighbors through walls so thin they barely deserved the name. The danger was not just discomfort, it was death arriving without warning. Fires were a constant threat in a city where everything was made of wood, straw, and fabric, and where people cooked with open braziers and cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. A single spark could consume an entire floor within minutes. Emperor Augustus himself had created the vigils, a kind of early fire brigade, precisely because fires in Rome were so frequent that the city needed an organized response just to avoid destroying itself. And beyond fire, there was structural collapse, buildings that gave way in the middle of the night, crushing their inhabitants without warning, without escape. The average Roman woke up each morning without any certainty that the roof above his head would still be there by nightfall. Safety was not a right, it was a rare stroke of luck that had to be renewed every single day. And it is precisely when life becomes this fragile, this stripped of guarantees, that a society begins to need something to channel all that accumulated tension, something that could turn fear into euphoria, anguish into a collective roar, and despair into deafening applause inside an arena that could hold tens of thousands of people. This something had a name that still echoes through the centuries: bread and circuses. The expression, coined by Juvenal himself, captured with brutal precision the strategy that kept Rome from imploding. The state ensured free grain distributions for the poorest and financed grand spectacles in the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, and dozens of arenas across the empire. Emperors watched from their boxes as crowds of tens of thousands roared, cheered, and for a few hours forgot everything that oppressed them outside. It was entertainment, but it was also, and above all, social control in its most sophisticated form. What took place inside those arenas went far beyond sport. Gladiators fought to the death before a crowd that could decide with a gesture the fate of the defeated. Exotic animals brought from Africa and Asia were slaughtered by the thousands in spectacles that could last for days. Condemned criminals were executed in elaborate, theatrical ways, turning punishment into a performance that blended horror and entertainment in proportions that would be unthinkable today. And the most disturbing part is that it worked. Violence stopped shocking and began uniting, creating a collective identity built on blood spilled at the center of the arena. There was a cold, calculated logic behind all that apparent brutality. Keeping the population fed and entertained was far cheaper and far more effective than dealing with uprisings and the fury of 1 million people with nothing to lose. Rome had discovered that the spectacle of death, when carefully managed, was a tool of governance as powerful as any army. But while the crowd applauded and emperors smiled from their seats, something silent continued its patient work, eroding Rome from within, cell by cell, in a process no arena could conceal forever. This silent process had a face no spectacle could conceal for long. Disease in Rome was not an exception, it was a permanent companion of daily life. In a city of 1 million people packed into a few square kilometers, without a truly efficient sewage system and with communal latrines where dozens of people sat side by side on cold stone, the environment became a perfect laboratory for the spread of infectious disease. Infant mortality was devastating. It is estimated that half of Roman children did not reach the age of 10. Half! A statistic that would freeze any modern parent in place. Physicians of the time did what they could with what they had, and what they had was shockingly limited in the face of the scale of the problem. Galen, the most influential doctor in the Roman world, prescribed herbs, bloodletting, and diets with a certainty that mixed genuine observation with entirely mistaken beliefs. There was real effort, but also a vast gap between the intellectual sophistication of Roman medicine and its actual ability to save lives. Fevers killed within days, intestinal infections wiped out entire families, and the contaminated water flowing into public fountains completed a cycle of disease and death that repeated itself with mechanical regularity. The result was a city where life was short, unpredictable, and constantly threatened by invisible enemies no sword could fight. And yet Rome did not slow down. It did not stop to heal, to reflect, or to reorganize its priorities, because stopping would mean confronting an uncomfortable truth that all that grandeur, all that power, and all that monumental engineering was being built on a foundation far more fragile than any marble column could ever suggest. And it is precisely in the face of this truth that Rome reveals its most fascinating and most disturbing side. What the history of the Roman Empire proves, above all, is that it is possible to build a superpower without electricity, without modern technology, and without the comforts the contemporary world considers essential. Aqueducts powered by gravity, roads connecting continents, an administration governing millions spread across 3 continents, all of it without a single electric wire, without a single engine. It is genuinely impressive. But impressive for whom exactly? For the senator dining in his luxurious domus while slaves served imported wine, Rome was the peak of human civilization. For the slave chained in the mines of Britannia, for the family crammed into a single room of an insula listening to the ceiling crack, for the mother burying her 3rd child before the age of 5, Rome was something entirely different. It was simply daily survival, repeated until the body could take no more. The same city, seen through different eyes, told radically different stories, and that tension was in itself the fuel that kept the system running. Rome's deepest legacy is not its aqueducts, not its laws, and not its monuments. Its deepest legacy is a warning that any greatness built on extreme inequality, systematic exploitation, and the invisibility of others' suffering carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The balance that seemed solid as marble was fragile as glass, held together by constant pressure, calculated control, and a carefully maintained narrative. And when that pressure began to fail, when resources grew scarce, and when bread and circuses were no longer enough to silence 1,000,000 voices, Rome began to hear the sound every empire fears: the silence before collapse. Rome existed 2,000 years ago, yet every detail of its history still feels like a mirror held up to the modern world. A city that controlled the masses through entertainment, that hid its flaws behind grand monuments, that built wonders on the invisible suffering of millions. Stop for a moment and think, how many of those same dynamics can you see around you in the 21st century? Bread and circuses may have changed form, but have they really changed in essence? And here's a provocation worth your reflection. If Rome, with all its power and control, still carried within it the seeds of its own collapse, what does that say about the power structures that exist today? Could the greatness we admire in the present also be hiding, deep in its foundations, a silent poison we have not yet learned to see? Rome was not an accident of history. It was a warning. And warnings only matter when someone stops to listen. Now it's your turn. Don't let this knowledge end here. Share this video with someone you know will have their mind blown by it. Comment below which detail of ancient Rome surprised you the most and why. And if you want to keep diving into the darkest, most fascinating, and most forgotten stories of the Roman Empire, you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the stories coming next are even more disturbing than everything you've seen today.